next meeting. Our next meeting on May 14th is wireless networks, the current threat landscape. That's the Manchester branch event here in the Reynolds building. And on June the 20th, in celebration of the 60th anniversary of the baby, the Kilburn lecture on the relentless march of the microchip will be held down the road at Computer Science Road. So, without further ado, may I introduce tonight's speaker? Richard Stallman.
Welcome. Please raise your hand if you cannot hear me. Let's try that again now that I can see your hands if they go up. Our society encourages people to judge programs in a shallow way, based only on practical convenience. How powerful is it? How reliable is it? What does it cost? And to ignore the most important questions. What does this program do to my freedom? What does this program do to the social solidarity of my community? These questions are what the free software movement is all about. Free software means software that respects the user's freedom. Software which is not free is proprietary software, user-subjugating software. It keeps the users divided and helpless. Divided because everyone is forbidden to share it with anyone else. And helpless because the users don't have the source code, so they can't change it. They can't even check independently what it's doing to them. But it's not enough just to say that we're in favor of freedom, because that's not specific enough. Well, even Gordon Clown says he's in favor of freedom. Even Bush says he's in favor of freedom, and Bush doesn't recognize freedom even after he's crushed it. So we really have to say something more specific. Which freedom is it that we are defending? A program is free software if it gives the user 4 essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code and change it so the program does what you wish. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help your neighbor. That's the freedom to distribute copies to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is the freedom to contribute to your community. That's the freedom to make and distribute copies of your modified versions when you wish. If you have all 4 freedoms, then the program is free software, because the social system of the program's distribution and use is an ethical system, respecting the user's freedom and respecting social solidarity. But if one of these freedoms is missing or insufficient, then the program is proprietary software, non-free software, user-subjugating software, because the social system of its distribution and use is unethical. To release a non-free program is not a contribution to society, it's an attack. It's an attempt to subjugate people. And we should hope it fails, and even better, it shouldn't be done at all. So if you have a choice between developing a proprietary program and developing no program, it's better to develop no program. At least then you're not hurting society. And thus, the goal of the free software movement is that all software be free so that all users are also free. But why are these four freedoms essential? Why define free software this way? Each freedom has its reason. Freedom 2, the freedom to help your neighbor, the freedom to make and distribute exact copies of the program, is essential on basic moral grounds, so you can live an upright life as a good member of your community. If you use a program without freedom 2, then you are in danger of falling into a moral dilemma. At any moment, whenever your friend says, "That program is nice, could I have a copy?" At that moment, you will face a choice between two evils. One evil is to give your friend a copy and violate the license of the program. The other evil is to deny your friend a copy and comply with the license of the program. Being in the dilemma, you ought to choose the lesser evil, which is to give your friend a copy and violate the license of the program. What makes this the lesser evil? If you can't help doing wrong to somebody or other, better to do it to somebody who has acted in a way that deserves it. Now, we can suppose that your friend is a good member of your community, and normally deserves your cooperation. It's not the only possibility, but it is a possibility, and it's the one that raises the dilemma in its clearest form. By contrast, the developer of this proprietary program has deliberately attacked the social solidarity of your community. So if you have to do wrong to one or the other, do it to the developer. However, being the lesser evil does not make it good. It's never a good thing to make an agreement and then break it. Now, some kinds of agreements are inherently evil, and keeping them is even worse than breaking them. This is an example. But still, breaking them is not good. And if you give your friend a copy, what will he have? He will have an unauthorized copy of a proprietary program. And that's something pretty bad. Almost as bad as an authorized copy. So once you have fully thought this through, what you should really do is make sure that you're never in this dilemma. There are two ways to do that. One is, don't have any friends. That's the method implicitly suggested by the developers of proprietary software. The other method is reject proprietary software. That's my method. If somebody offers me a program on the condition that I promise not to share it with you, no matter how convenient or attractive it might be, I will reject it because my conscience requires me to reject it. Because to accept it would be betrayal of my community. And I will not do that. So I will tell that person that he's doing something rotten and he should get out of my office. We should reject the software that forbids us to cooperate in our communities. And we should also reject the propaganda terms that they use to demonize cooperation. Terms like piracy. What are they saying when they call sharing piracy? They are trying to equate helping your neighbor with attacking a ship. And nothing could be ethically more wrong than that, because attacking a ship is very bad, but helping your neighbor is the right thing to do. So if our adversaries try to ask you about piracy, don't fall into their trap. When people ask me what I think of software piracy, I say, I don't think pirates use software, they use guns. I'm on my toes about this. I've trained myself not to fall into the trap of repeating and legitimizing the propaganda that tries to call sharing wrong. So that's the reason for freedom 2, the freedom to help your neighbor. Freedom 0 is essential so you can control your computing. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish. There are proprietary programs that don't even give you that freedom. They may restrict who can run the authorized copy, or on which computer, or how much, or when, or for what purpose. And this is obviously not having control of your computing. But, and so freedom 0 is essential. And it almost goes without saying. For many years I thought I didn't need to mention it. That's why when I started to talk about it, I put it, it's so basic it has to go at the beginning of the list. That's why it's number 0. But freedom 0 is not enough, because the developer goes on controlling your computing not through a license, but rather through the code. The developer decides what the code can do and decides what it can't do, and in this way still has power over you. So you need freedom number 1, the freedom to study the source code and change it so that the program does what you wish. This way you decide instead of the developers deciding for you. If you use a program without freedom 1, you can't even tell what it's doing to you. And many of these programs do nasty things. They have malicious features that were designed to spy on the user, or restrict the user, or even attack the user. Many non-free programs spy on the user. It's called spyware, and it's quite common. One proprietary program you may have heard of that spies on the user is called Microsoft Windows. When the user of Windows, and I won't say you because I'm sure you wouldn't use a nasty program like this, when the user of Windows invokes the menu command to search her own files for a word, Windows sends a message to Microsoft saying what word was searched for. That is one spy feature. But there's another. When Windows XP asks for an upgrade over the net, it sends Microsoft the list of all the programs installed in the machine. Another spy feature. But Microsoft never announced these spy features. People discovered them by investigation. So it's quite possible that there are other spy features in Windows that people haven't found yet. Who knows how many there might be. But spying on the user is not limited to Windows. Windows Media Player also spies on the user. In fact, it does total surveillance. It reports everything the user looks at. But please don't think that Microsoft is uniquely evil and that only Microsoft would treat the user so badly. In fact, Real Player spies the same way. And we are pretty sure, we're almost sure, that Real Player did it first. The facts we know are not quite conclusive, the dates we know, but it looks like Real Player probably did it first. After all, Microsoft is more known for imitation than for invention. Spying is pretty nasty, but it gets worse. There's also the functionality of refusing to function, where the program says, I don't want to show you the contents of this file, even though it's in your computer. I don't want to let you copy part of this file, even though it's in your computer. I don't want to print this file for you, because I don't like you. Now, those programs really don't like you. It's not their job to serve you, it's their job to control you. They're not working for you, they're working for somebody else. They are your prison guards. This kind of malicious feature is also known as DRM, Digital Restrictions Management. The intentional malicious feature of refusing to function for you. Many companies do this. Microsoft does this, Apple does this, Adobe does this, Google does this, Sony does this, Amazon does this. It's extremely nasty and widespread. So we have set up a campaign of protests against digital restrictions management. You can find it in the site defectivebydesign.org, which is a good description of any product that has DRM. It's designed not to work. Go to the site and sign up and participate in our protests because we need to make them very big. We need your help. Don't assume we will win this battle without you. We have had protests in the street against Microsoft, against Apple, against movie theaters, against public libraries that distribute things with DRM, and we're going to have more. Windows Vista is a tremendous advance in the technology of restricting users. That appears to be its primary purpose. In fact, Windows Vista requires the users to junk and replace perfectly working hardware because it wasn't designed to restrict the users completely. So they decided to require people to replace it with other hardware that was designed specifically to tie the users up. Now, you can't live in freedom using any version of Windows because they're all proprietary, non-free software. So every Windows user ought to escape to freedom. They ought to defenestrate their computers, which means either throw Windows out of the computer or throw the computer out the window. But those who are not yet ready to do this and move to freedom at least should avoid downgrading to Vista. So we've set up another campaign in the site badvista.org, which shows you the Vista that would await you as a user of Windows Vista and why you shouldn't be one. Now, these malicious features are very nasty, and they always attack your freedom at two levels at once. First of all, the purpose of these features is to attack your freedom, to restrict your use of your copies of works that you have bought, and to stop you from doing things that would otherwise be your legal right. But in addition, they also make it impossible to access these works even in the permitted ways, except using proprietary software. And the proprietary software itself is an attack on your freedom. So there are two evils combined every time there is DRM. And the DRM is almost always imposed by a conspiracy of companies working together. For instance, a computer company and various big media companies, publishers, record companies, movie companies, whatever. We're all conspiring. So these are conspiracies of businesses to restrict the technology available to the public. They design a secret format, and then they say anyone that wants to make a player has to sign a contract with us and promise to restrict the users just like all the other players we have authorized, which essentially eliminates competition as a force for making things any better. The there may be 20 brands of DVD players, but they all restrict you the same way. They all have the same limitations required and imposed by the DVD conspiracy. Now, you might wonder how we found out about these conspiracies. How do we prove that they exist? It's easy. You just look at the websites where they proudly announce what they are doing. They are so confident that our governments are on their side against their own citizens that they don't even feel a need to hide what they are doing to the public. When's the last time that Clown ever tried to do something that was good for citizens of the UK instead of good for business? Maybe he did sometime or other. So this is why we know about these conspiracies, because they're not even secret. That shows how undemocratic our governments are. Democratic governments would make these conspiracies a crime. They would say that businesses are not allowed to conspire to restrict the technology available to the public. Once in a while, there may be a reason to restrict what kinds of technical devices we can have. It makes sense to require cars to be roadworthy, for instance. Okay, that should be established as a governmental policy and voted on. But a conspiracy of companies should not be allowed to impose such decisions on the public. And the executives of all those companies I mentioned should be in prison. But there's even worse. There are the malicious features designed to attack the user. Backdoors. One proprietary program that has a backdoor that you may have heard of is called Microsoft Windows. You see, starting with Windows XP, Microsoft arranged to more or less determine the user's identity, which means that whenever Windows XP gets an upgrade, Microsoft can deliver to that user an upgrade designed specifically for him, meaning it can take control of his computer and wipe the floor with him, and the user essentially has no recourse. This is the backdoor whose existence we can deduce from the known facts. Are there others? A few years ago in India, I was told that they had arrested some of the developers of Windows and accused them of working not just for Microsoft, but also for Al-Qaeda, installing another backdoor that Microsoft wasn't supposed to know about. That attempt apparently failed. Was there another that succeeded? We can't check. But we do know that Microsoft itself installed a backdoor in a piece of server software on behalf of another terrorist organization, even more violent, namely the United States government, specifically for the use of the NSA. This was discovered in 1999. And it shows that you can't trust non-free software. Every piece of non-free software is just trust me software. Just trust me because that's the only way you could possibly use it. There's no basis to do anything but place blind faith in the developer, because the developer keeps you unable to do anything else. Now, with Windows XP, the user at least has the option of turning off upgrades. Microsoft has been caught doing upgrades without asking, but I believe that the upgrade facility has to be enabled for that to happen. Now, turning off upgrades completely might be dangerous in other ways, but at least it keeps you safe from Microsoft. So, of course, Windows Vista eliminates that option. With Windows Vista, Microsoft can always forcibly change the software whenever the machine is on the net. But please do not think that Microsoft is uniquely evil. Microsoft is doing whatever a developer of just what a proprietary software developer is tempted to do, namely, use the power that proprietary software gives it over the users. In fact, I'm told that Mac OS X does the same thing. Apple can forcibly change the software without getting the user's permission. So it's an understatement to say that Microsoft and Apple can take control of the user's computer. They always have it. They have total control, always starting from the first moment that the machine goes on the net. That is what proprietary software means. It means unjust power in the hands of organizations that don't work for you, do not represent you, and don't care about you except for what they can get from you. So, we can never trust a program without freedom one, and we can never ascertain that such a program has no malicious features. Sometimes we find a malicious feature, but we can never prove that a program doesn't have them. So we can divide these programs into two classes. They're the ones in which we know of malicious features, and the ones in which we don't know of any. Now, some of them have malicious features and some don't, but we can't tell which is which. The only case in which we can tell is when we find a malicious feature, and that puts the program in this class. So we've got these programs, some of which, but we don't know which ones, have no malicious features. We can't identify them, but we can say something about them. Their developers are human, so they make mistakes. The code of those programs has bugs. And the user of a program without freedom one is just as helpless facing an accidental bug as facing an intentional malicious feature. If you use a program without freedom one, you're a prisoner of your software. We, the developers of free software, are also human. We also make mistakes, and the code of our programs also has bugs. But if you find a bug in our code, or anything in our code that you don't like, you are free to fix it. We can't be perfect. We can respect your freedom. And that is what makes the difference. But freedom one is not enough. Freedom one is the freedom to personally study and change the source code. That's not enough because there are millions of computer users that don't know how to program. So they're not able to exercise freedom one personally, directly. But even for programmers like me, freedom one's not enough because there's too much software in the world. In fact, there's too much free software in the world for any one person to study and master all the software she uses and then personally make all the changes she might want. That's more than one person can do. So to fully take control of our computing, we need to do it working together. And for that, we need freedom three. The freedom to contribute to your community, the freedom to make and distribute copies of your modified versions. That permits us to cooperate. So if people want, if the users of a certain free program want progress in this direction, somebody will make a change and publish his modified version. And somebody else will take that and make another change going further in this direction and publish her modified version. And somebody will start with that and make another change and publish his modified version. And the result will be progress, which they will have cooperated to make. Whether or not they started with the intention of working together, that will be what it turned out that they did. And the result is that all the users get the benefit of the 4 freedoms, of the fact that we all have the 4 freedoms. Every user can exercise freedoms 0 and 2, the freedom to run the program as you wish and the freedom to make and distribute exact copies, because those don't require programming. Anyone who can use the program can do those things. Freedoms 1 and 3 entail programming. Those are the freedoms to study and change the source code, and then optionally to distribute copies of your modified version. So any given user can exercise these freedoms more or less depending on how much he knows how to program. And there are various levels of knowing how to program. It's quite useful to learn how to make easy changes, even if you don't learn enough programming that you could be a professional programmer. Just as it's quite useful to learn how to do easy kinds of maintenance on your car, even if you don't learn enough to be a professional mechanic. But there are lots of people who don't want to learn any programming, and they can't directly exercise these freedoms. But when other people, the programmers, do exercise them and release their modified versions, anyone else can then install them. So we all get the benefits of living in a society where the users have these freedoms. And the combined result of these 4 freedoms is democracy. A free program develops democratically under the control of its users. All the users are free to participate as much as they wish in society's decision about the future of this program, which is simply the sum total of all the individual decisions people make about what they're going to do with it. This is why we don't generally find malicious features in free software. Because when everyone has freedom, that means nobody has power. With free software, nobody has the power to impose, to put in a malicious feature and make it stick. Yes, theoretically someone could put in a malicious feature and someone else can take it out. And the result will be that the one who put it in, who thought he was going to impose his power over the users, will fail and will have a very bad reputation. With proprietary software, we see lots of malicious features because proprietary software develops under the dictatorship of its developer and gives that developer power over all the users. It's an instrument of a power grab. Because the developers have power, they can put in malicious features and nobody else can take them out. So the only way to escape from the malicious features is to escape from the non-free software. And that is what the free software movement is all about. So that's free software from a human rights point of view. A secondary point of view, which many people are nonetheless interested in, is the business point of view. How does free software affect business? Well, only a very small fraction of businesses do software development, but lots of them use software because they use computers. And the 4 freedoms are vital to any user of software for whatever the purpose is, including all the businesses that use computers. And businesses can take advantage of the 4 freedoms to get what they want in their software, even if those businesses don't know how to do any programming. Here's how. Suppose if there are 1,000 users of a free program that want a certain change, and suppose that none of them knows how to program. They might be businesses or they might be individuals doing other things. Either way, they can take advantage of the 4 freedoms to get the change they want. Here's how. They can make announcements saying, I'd like this change. Does anyone else want this change? Then they get in touch with each other, and they can start an organization to make the change. The idea is that they all become members and pay dues. And this way the organization raises some money to pay a programmer to do the job. Now, if it is a medium-sized job, it might take a month of work for a particular skilled programmer, and it might cost £5,000. So the organization can say, everybody join and pay £5. If it's a bigger job and it takes a year of work, it might cost £50,000. So they'd say, okay, everybody please join and pay £50. But if 1,000 businesses think that this change is going to help them, and if it's a big change, it's probably because they think it's going to help them a lot. And £50 would be nothing to get the benefit of that change. So they will join. Of course, the organization has to decide who to pay. So it will talk with one group of programmers and say, could you do this? When could it be done? What would you charge? Please show us your portfolio so we can judge your skills. And then it will talk with another group and another group and another group and eventually decide. And this shows something very interesting. Free software brings with it a free market for all kinds of support and services. By contrast, proprietary software support is typically a monopoly. Only the developer has the source code, so only the developer can make any change. If the user wants a change, the user has to pray to the developer. Oh, almighty developer, please make this change for me. Some developers say, pay us and we'll listen to your problem. If the user pays, the developer says, thank you so much. In 6 months there will be an upgrade. Buy the upgrade and you'll see if we fixed your problem. And you'll see what new problems we have delivered to you. But with free software, anyone that has a copy can study the source code, master it, if he has the ability, and then offer support. So it's a free market, easy to enter for anyone with the capabilities. Thus, all those organizations and businesses and agencies that say that good support is essential for them, and that say that they believe that a free market generally provides better goods and services to the buyer, rationally ought to insist on running only free software so that they can get their support through the free market. They should put an end to these support monopolies. Now, this leads to an interesting paradox. You see, normally when there's a choice between products to do a job, we say there's no monopoly. But when there is a choice between proprietary software products, yes, there is monopoly. Because if the user chooses this proprietary product, she falls into this monopoly for support. But if she chooses this proprietary product, she falls into this monopoly for support. So yes, there is monopoly. It's a choice between monopolies. And the only way to escape from monopoly is to escape from proprietary software, to escape to the free world. The free world is the new continent in cyberspace that we have built so that we can live here in freedom. It was impossible to live in freedom in the old world of cyberspace, where every program had its lord who commanded and mistreated the users. So we had to build a place we could escape to. Because it's a virtual continent, there is room for everyone. Everyone is welcome, and there are no immigration restrictions. And because there were never any indigenous peoples in cyberspace, there also never was the issue of kicking them off their land. So everyone should come to the free world Every one of you should live in freedom. And the goal of the free software movement is the liberation of cyberspace and all of its inhabitants. All of you. I reached these conclusions, although not in their present form. I reached these views in 1983. And I wanted to be able to live in freedom while using computers. But how could that ever be possible? In 1983, it was impossible, because the computer won't do anything without an operating system, and all the operating systems for the modern computers of the day were proprietary, user-subjugating software. You had to sign a non-disclosure agreement just to get a binary. And how could I ever change that? I was one man, not particularly famous, except outside the community of except in the community of editor-developers, and I had no political skill or experience, so I didn't suppose that I could just organize people to demand that governments change their laws or that companies change their practices. It didn't look like I could succeed that way. But I recognized that there was another way I could achieve the same goal. The problem was all the operating systems were proprietary, and I was an operating system developer. All I had to do was write another operating system, and then I, being the author, could make it free. And this way, everyone would be able to use computers in freedom. In other words, I had come up with a technical means to correct and eliminate this social problem. So, I was aware of an important and growing social problem that most people didn't recognize as a problem. I had the skills necessary to try to do something about this problem, and it looked like nobody else would do it if I did not. That meant I had been elected by circumstances to do this work. It was my duty. It's as if you saw someone drowning and you knew how to swim and there were no one else around, and it's not Bush or Bly or anyone else that supports torture and wars of conquest and imprisonment without trial or total surveillance.
Rendition.
Yeah, well, that's torture and imprisonment without trial. Then you have a moral duty to save that person. Well, I don't know how to swim, but in this case the job to be done was not swimming, it was developing lots of code, and that I knew how to do. So I decided I would develop a free software operating system or die trying. Of old age, presumably. Because at the time, the free software movement that I was starting had no active enemies. Lots of people disagreed with it, but they just said, that's silly, and paid no more attention. So the obstacle was not opposition, it was a pile of software we would have to develop in order to have a complete free operating system. And at the time, nobody knew if this project would ever be completed. I didn't know either. But when it's a matter of fighting for freedom, you can't afford to wait until victory is at hand before you start the struggle. Because that means you miss most of the opportunities when you might have won. So you have to start when you're not sure whether you're going to win. And then you have a chance to win. Once I decided to develop the system, my next decision was to ask other people to join in and help. That way we might get it done sooner. It was a big job. Then I had to make technical decisions. I decided to make it a Unix-like system because Unix was a portable system. I knew it would take many years to complete another operating system, and during that time, computer architectures could change. So if the system wasn't portable, it could be obsolete before it was finished. By making it Unix-like, I figured there would be a good chance it would be portable and able to run on whatever computers people would be using then. And I decided to make it upward compatible with Unix so that the many Unix users would find it easy to switch. This made almost all the initial design decisions, because the design of Unix is it consisted of hundreds of components that communicated through interfaces more or less documented, and the users used the same interfaces to talk to these programs. To be compatible, you had to keep the same interfaces and replace each component compatibly one by one, which meant the project had already been neatly subdivided into little, or some cases big, pieces. So the only thing I needed to start work was a name. Of course, I looked for a funny name, because in the community of free software in which I participated in the 1970s, we were programming for the fascination of programming. We called ourselves hackers, which basically meant that we enjoyed playful cleverness in programming and in other areas of life too. And therefore, when we wrote programs that were useful, which we most of the time were doing, it wasn't just for fun, it was also to be useful. We would often give our programs funny or even mischievous names. Like there was a guy who didn't believe in acronyms, so he called his program the String Handling Interpretive Translator, which people usually just shorten to string. Now, back in the 70s, system programming was not portable. All across the computer field, it was quite common that you would see a really neat system utility which was written for some other kind of computer, and you'd want to be able to do that, so you would have to write another such program. In our community, we had a special tradition for such cases. You could give your program a name that was a recursive acronym saying that your program is not the other one. It's a funny way of giving credit. So, for instance, in 1976, I developed the first Emacs text editor. This was an extensible programmable editor. You could reprogram it in the middle of your editing session, and afterwards there were about 30 imitations of Emacs. And some of them were called this or that Emacs, which is straightforward and not funny. But one was called Fine, for Fine is not Emacs. And there was Sign, for Sign is not Emacs. And Ina, for Ina is not Emacs. And Mince, for Mince is not complete Emacs. And version 2 of Ina was called Zwei, for Zwei was Ina initially. You can have lots of fun with recursive acronyms. So I looked for a recursive acronym for something is not Unix. But nothing of that form is a word, and if it doesn't have another meaning, it's not funny. So what could I do? I thought, well, I could make a contraction and get rid of the word is, and that way I'd have blank NU. So I started trying every initial, Anu, Bnu, Knu, Dnu, Inu, Fnu, Gnu. Well, GNU is the funniest word in the English language. Used in countless plays on words. So, given a specific, meaningful reason to use this as the name for my system, I couldn't resist. Now, the reason why the word GNU is used in so much wordplay is, according to the dictionary, the G is silent and it's pronounced new. So anytime you wanted to write the word new, you can write it GNU and you've got a joke. Perhaps not a very good one, but there are lots of them. And sometimes it is a good joke, as in the song I'm a GNU, which I heard when I was a child. So I couldn't resist it. But you got to be careful, because when it's the name of our system, you must not follow the dictionary. If you call it the GNU system, you'll get people confused, because we've been working on it for 24 years now, and we've been using it for 15 years, so it's not new anymore. But it still is GNU, and it always will be GNU, no matter how many people erroneously call it Linux. But how would such a strange error happen? Well, during the 80s, our work was to develop all these components, which we did in any which order. We didn't need to develop them in any particular order, we just needed to have them all. So I just kept looking for who would develop this one, and sometimes he would and sometimes he wouldn't, and I'd look for someone else. And I would look for things, for the big components, I would look for something we could start with to make it less work. And it turned out by 1990 there was only one of the major components that we didn't have. That component is the so-called kernel, which is the program that allocates the machine's resources to the other programs you run. And I had been looking for something to start with, and I finally found it. I found a so-called microkernel called Mach, basically, which did the bottom half of the kernel's job, which meant, and it was just about to be released as free software, so we could use that as the base. We would only have to write the top half, and that would be running in user space, which meant that if something crashed, it wouldn't crash the whole machine, and you could debug it with a source level debugger. I thought that for all these reasons, we would get it finished quickly. We decided to make it a collection of modular server programs, each one of which that would do one of the kernel services, and they would communicate through message passing. Now, the FSF hired a person to write this. I didn't work on writing it. And so I never directly saw why it was going so slowly. But it took many years to get this kernel to run at all. And it still doesn't work very well. In fact, fundamental problems have been discovered in the design, which nobody anticipated. In 1990, this design of a microkernel and servers was the elegant idea that everyone thought would be the coming thing. Well, you know, we started so many software projects, nobody's successful all the time. Fortunately, we didn't have to wait for it. So the fact that we haven't made a success of this kernel is sad, but it's not a disaster. Because in 1991, a college student, Mr. Torvalds, developed his own kernel. He used the usual monolithic design, and he got it to barely work in less than a year. This kernel was called Linux, and initially it was not free software. At the first release, the license was too restrictive. It did not allow commercial redistribution. And since these 4 freedoms are meant to be for all users and all uses, that kind of restriction is unacceptable. However, in 1992, he changed the license, and he adopted the GNU General Public License, which is a license that I had written to use it in the GNU packages, the packages we were developing for the GNU system. The GNU GPL is one of many free software licenses. There's a common misconception that equates free software to software released under the GNU GPL. This is erroneous. There are other free software licenses too. In fact, any license that grants the user the 4 freedoms is a free software license, because it makes the program free software. However, the GNU GPL is the most widely used free software license, used in something like 70% of all free software packages. And this probably has something to do with the fact that it is a copyleft license. Now, what does copyleft mean? Well, every free software license has to give you freedoms 2 and 3. The freedom to distribute exact copies and modified versions. But there's more than one way to give you those freedoms. Some people would like to take the free software and then redistribute it without freedom to somebody else that will not have freedom then. So the question is that allowed? Some free software licenses permit that, and some say when you redistribute this program, whether it's exactly copied or with changes, you must pass on to the next person the same freedoms that you got from us. And the way we do that is we say, you must make the source code available, you must do it under this same license. And basically we put on whatever conditions are needed to make sure that every user gets the 4 freedoms. So we do this by telling the middlemen that they are not allowed to strip off the 4 freedoms. We make these 4 freedoms unalienable rights so that all users will have them. That technique is copyleft, and it is implemented in the GNU GPL, which I wrote. So when Torvalds adopted the GNU GPL as the license for Linux, it became free software. And thus the combination of the almost complete GNU system plus the kernel Linux made a complete free operating system. And the goal that I had announced in 1983 was reached in 1992. And for the first time, it was possible to get a PC and run it in freedom. The development of Linux, the kernel, was a major contribution to the free software community. It gave us one of the major essential components of the first free operating system. In effect, it was the step that carried us across the finish line. It was able to do that because of all the steps we had taken to get almost there. But many people noticed only the last step and failed to focus on all the other steps that had got us to that point. And the people who started making these combinations and distributing them made the error of calling them Linux systems even though they were mostly GNU. And that's how this error got started. That's how it happened that millions of people use this variant of the GNU system, and they don't know it's the GNU system. They think it's Linux, and it was started in 1991 by Linus Torvalds. And if they hear about GNU at all, they think that the GNU project developed some tools which turned out to be useful in Linux, which is a completely backwards picture, and in any case, only part of what we developed was tools anyway. We developed lots of things, but the tools are the things that many people think about, and they forget all the rest. Now, this is obviously unfair to us. We started this project, we did the biggest part of the work, and we usually get none of the credit. So please don't call it the Linux system. Call it the GNU/Linux operating system. If we did the biggest part of the work, we ought to get at least equal mention. Equivalent to a circuit. This is something I had to deal with in the 1980s because I had a microwave oven. I think I had one. Well, either I had one or I thought I might. And the question was, did the microwave oven have software in it? And if so, was that a problem? And the point is, I didn't know if it had software in it. I couldn't tell. Now, if I took it apart, I could tell, but using it, I couldn't tell. And what that shows is it's not a computer for the user. It might be implemented using a computer, but the job it does for the user is not the job of being programmable. And that means the fact that you can't really tell as a user whether it's got a computer in it or not shows that it doesn't make a difference whether it has a computer in it or not. And thus I concluded that it didn't matter. You didn't need to check whether your microwave oven has a computer in it. You could ignore that. On the other hand, with a PC, where people install software, that is doing the job of being programmable. You can't ignore whether the software there is free. Anyway, getting back to whatever the point was I was making before you asked that question, that's why I'd rather the questions wait for the end.
Fresh out for credit?
Yeah. Well, I've got to admit that credit is not the most important ethical issue in life. So if it were just an issue of credit, it wouldn't be worth bringing it up. It wouldn't be worth making the fuss I make about it. But there's something else more important at stake in your choice of the name to call the system. Your freedom is at stake. Indirectly, of course. Because a name doesn't directly change anything. But different names convey different messages. And those convey different ideas to other people. And that has an effect on what they do. And over a period of years, what messages people are giving to others has an effect on our future. In fact, nothing has a bigger effect on our future. Our future depends above all on what we value. Freedom is frequently threatened. And if people don't defend their freedom, they're likely to lose it. I usually cite the US as an example, but the UK is just as good an example of that danger. In both of these countries, our freedom has been taken away. Fundamental human rights have been attacked by our own leaders, who turn out to be our country's worst enemies. And they do this saying they're protecting us from other secondary dangers, which they exaggerate and dwell on to distract us from how dangerous they are. Now, in other areas of life, people have been debating issues of human rights for centuries. Plenty of time to reach conclusions about what human rights everyone is entitled to, and spread these ideas around the world. That doesn't guarantee we will succeed in defending them, but at least it gives us a base to try. But in order for people to try to defend their freedom, they need to appreciate and value their freedom. And to do that, they need to know what it means. Computing is a new area of life. It's only about 15 years now that in a few most advanced countries, most people have used computers. That's not much time to have a debate about what human rights should belong to the user of software. And in fact, there has been very little debate. Most computer users started with proprietary software, and everyone else they knew was using proprietary software. They never heard of any other possibility. And so they just allowed the proprietary software developers to dictate the answers instead of having any real debate. We in the free software movement have been trying to start this debate. We have identified 4 human rights that the user of software should always have. But our attempts to bring these ideas to the attention of the public are hampered by the fact that the tens of millions of people using the free system that we developed in order to give them freedom don't know it's ours. The name GNU has always been associated since the beginning of the GNU project with ideas of freedom. The name Linux is associated with very different ideas. The ideas of its developer, Mr. Torvalds. And what are they? he says that he values powerful, reliable software. He has the values of an engineer. He prefers not to think about issues of freedom. And he has managed to get the name of his kernel associated with his ideas. He has a right to promote his views. But it isn't right that our much larger and earlier work should be credited to him and serve as a platform for his views against ours. And it not only isn't right, but it's dangerous for you. Because when people think the system is Linux, they tend to look to Mr. Torvalds for guidance on these ethical issues. And where is he going to lead them? He's not going to lead them to defend their freedom. And if they don't defend their freedom, we will be fewer as we try to defend ours. That is dangerous. The future of our community depends above all on what we value. And if we do not value freedom, if we do not talk about the value of freedom, we are much more likely to lose it. And this is not just a future possibility. You can see it happening. In fact, it's already happened. In 1992, the combination of, when Linux became free, the combination of GNU and Linux made a free operating system, and it was possible to use a PC in freedom. But just because it's that way at one time doesn't mean it's guaranteed to stay that way. Around 1994 or 5, there were a number of different distributions of gnu+linux, effectively competing with each other. And some distribution developers started putting in some add-ons that were not free software. And they presented this as a bonus. They said, with our distribution, look what you get. These wonderful, convenient programs. And the only bad thing is they take away your freedom. They didn't say that part. They just said, look what you get, these wonderful programs. So the users who didn't care about freedom started getting attracted to those distributions. The developers of the other distros were competing with them, and they said, uh-oh, we're at a disadvantage. They're attracting the users with that neat program, which isn't free. So we better put in that program too. And so over a number of years, all the distributions started having non-free programs. And there was no free distribution of gnu+linux. And when people asked me after my speeches, where do you recommend I get the system? I had to tell them, I don't know of any place I can recommend. Because every distribution offers to install for you non-free software. And if I recommended it, I'd be sending you to non-free software. And that is against my conscience, so I won't do it. Well, that was an awfully sad situation. We reached a freedom and we fell back from it for failure to care about it. And that's what happens to people who don't value their freedom. They lose it through failure to take any trouble to protect it. That's what happened in the US, that's what's happened here, and that happened in the free software community too. Well, I'm happy to say that today there are some free distros. There is Ututo, U-T-U-T-O. There is BLAG, which stands for Blag, Linux, and GNU. And there is GNUsense, G-N-E-W-S-E-N-S-E. All of which have the policy of excluding non-free software. But those are not the well-known distributions. The well-known distributions continue putting in non-free programs. In fact, Linux, in its usual version, contains non-free software too. Because Torvalds has never been committed to any principle of freedom. For some years, he was publicly using a non-free program in the development of Linux. Now, if he'd been using it privately, I wouldn't have made a fuss about it. But he used it very publicly, inviting all the people working on it with him to use it too. So I had to publicly criticize that. It was setting a very bad example for our community. And then we discovered that there were non-free parts in Linux. Now, they don't run on the CPU. They're so-called firmware, which means that they're meant to be installed into other computers in various devices on the machine. But you can't ignore them if they're inside of Linux. You can't say that Linux is free software if it contains these things. And what makes them non-free? Well, the supposed source code is actually a vector of thousands of numbers. It's really a binary program masquerading as C source code. And that's not source code. It's self-delusion. So the free distros have a free version of Linux, which doesn't have that firmware, which means that certain I/O devices won't work. Well, you know, if you want freedom, you've got to be prepared sometimes to accept inconveniences to defend it. The people who won't ever accept an inconvenience to defend their freedom, they will lose it. Fortunately, these are small inconveniences, not like what some people have sometimes had to suffer to defend their freedom. You know, it takes a hero to risk his life for freedom. To accept these little inconveniences, you don't have to be a hero. In fact, you have to be a horrible coward if you won't. So we're still fighting for freedom, and you know, sometimes we convince a company to start releasing the specs and let us write free software to do those jobs. The point is, it's a struggle, and we're more likely to win if we are struggling, if we're joining in the campaign, if we're demanding freedom. And this is precisely what the ideas associated with the name Linux fail to suggest. And nowadays, those people don't talk about free software either. In 1998, they coined a different term they could use instead so as to get away from all the ideas associated with the term free software, including the idea that this is an ethical imperative for respecting users' freedom. They prefer the term open source. And if you look at the things that are typically associated with the term open source and compare them with the ideas of the free software movement, you'll see a contrast like night and day. They're talking about basically the same set of software, but what they say about it in terms of philosophical values is totally different. They only cite practical values like having powerful, reliable software. They don't say this is a matter of your freedom and the social solidarity of your community. And if you don't talk about it, you won't lead other people to think about it. This is especially important because today we have something we didn't have 20 years ago. Powerful enemies. Companies that don't want us to be able to distribute free software to do certain jobs. For instance, the conspiracies that inflict digital restrictions management on the world, they don't want us to be able to distribute free software that will enable the users to use those works. So first, what do? They keep the format secret so that we won't see how to write any free software. And then when they discovered that people would figure out these formats and would be able to write the free software, then they purchased laws to forbid the distribution of this free software. Of course, the first place they did this was in the United States. In 1998, the U.S. adopted the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which we could call the Domination Millennium Cruelty Act, which forbade the distribution of free software capable of breaking the digital handcuffs of DRM. Thus, free software exists to play the movie on a DVD, and the distribution of that software is illegal in the US, so the US practices censorship of software and does so on behalf of mega corporations that wish to restrict the citizens. I'm sad to say that the European Union adopted a similar directive, and I believe all the countries of Europe adopted that directive and implemented it worse than was required. So the distribution of that software is prohibited in all countries of the EU except Finland. Finland has the same law, but a court ruled that this software is so widespread that this system no longer functions effectively to stop people from doing anything, which means that the law no longer applies to it, and thus in Finland this software is not censored. I have to wonder how long it will be before Disney and Sony and so on purchase another law there that overrules that decision. I'm sure they're going to try. And this is what you get when you have government of the people by the corrupted for the megacorporations. It's not democracy, it's corporatocracy. And the laws are designed to keep us under the power of the empire. In effect, our governments are governments of occupation. They're not there to work for us. They're there to give us as little as they possibly can and give the megacorporations as much as they possibly can. So, freedom is not easy to defend, but at least in the free software movement, we sometimes have victories. But we're going to have to pay attention if we want to keep having them. And therefore, please support the free software movement. And this does not just mean developing code for free programs. Of course, there's a lot of that to be done. But it's not just that anymore. We need to organize politically. We need to insist that our governments talk to us with formats that are publicly documented and that everyone is free to implement in free software. Governments should never send people Word files or ask people to send them Word files. Governments should refuse to use OOXML, which is partially patented by Microsoft and perhaps at the same time by lots of others, who knows, and which has a specification 6,000 pages long, so that it's unlikely anyone could succeed in implementing it. We have to insist that our governments stop teaching children to use proprietary software. We have a lot of struggle ahead of us, but the amount that we have achieved suggests that we have a chance to win. I'd like to cover a couple of secondary topics. One is free software and employment. Some people like to spread fear that if the world moves to free software, all the jobs in the IT sector will disappear. Well, to a first approximation, the jobs in the IT sector have disappeared anyway in the wealthier countries. They all moved somewhere else. But not quite all. I mean, there still are some. So let's look at the IT sector jobs. Well, programming is a small fraction of that. Most of it's other things. Now look at the paid programming. Development of proprietary software is a small fraction of that. Most of it is development of custom software for one client. Now, if the world migrates to free software, the work developing proprietary software will go away, and good riddance. But the custom software jobs will still be there. They won't be in here any more than they are now, but they will still exist at least. And the reason is, if somebody wants a certain program developed for her particular needs this year, she's going to have to pay somebody, especially if she's running a business. Now, there might be a volunteer who could do that, but if she asks a volunteer, please write this program because it would be useful for me to make money, that person might say, well, you know, I volunteer a lot of my time for free software, but if you want me to do that for you, you're going to have to pay me. And the fact is, these businesses, these clients are going to have to pay anyway to get somebody to do this work. So basically, free software doesn't change the custom software development business in any fundamental way. So the worst thing that could happen is we lose a small fraction of the IT sector employment. But that doesn't mean we won't necessarily lose jobs, we might gain them. You see, free software generates jobs too. It generates jobs adapting and extending free software. That's not an option with proprietary software because only the developer has the source code, so you can't adapt it. But with free software you can, and sometimes businesses or other organizations want to pay you to do so. So there are a small fraction of jobs that will go away, and then there's some jobs that we gain. Is the net result an increase or a decrease? I don't know. I'm not an economist, and I don't know how to try to predict that. But what we can see is even the worst possible outcome is no disaster. There's nothing to be afraid of. The second specific topic is free software and education. Schools must use exclusively free software for their educational activities. And there are 4 reasons for this. The most superficial is to save money. Even in the wealthiest countries, the schools are limited by their budgets. They don't have enough money, so they can't excuse wasting any of it paying for permission to run proprietary software. This is rather superficial and pretty obvious. Even the people who have no idea what free software means understand this. But some proprietary software companies eliminate this reason by offering gratis or nearly gratis copies of their non-free software to the schools. And when we ask why they do this, we'll see the next reason why the schools must insist on free software. Do they do this because they're idealistic and want to promote education? I don't think so. They, I believe, are trying to use the schools as instruments to make society dependent on their proprietary software. Here's how the scheme works. They provide nearly gratis copies to the schools teach the students to use them, the students become dependent on them, and they graduate with this dependency. And after they graduate, you can be sure the same companies are not going to offer them gratis copies anymore. And they certainly won't offer gratis copies to the companies they go to work for after they graduate. So the idea is the schools push the students down the path of ever-increasing dependency, and the students then drag society along with them. Schools should refuse to participate in such a nasty scheme, just as schools would refuse to accept gratis samples of addictive drugs to give to their students to give them a dependency. They should also reject the proprietary software because the schools have a social mission. Their mission is to educate the next generation to be good citizens of a strong, capable, independent, cooperating, and free society. And this means teaching them to use free software, not proprietary software. But there's a deeper reason, which is for the sake of the education of the best programmers. Some people are natural-born programmers, and at the age of 13 or so, they are fascinated with computers, and they want to learn all about how the computer and its system work. So if this youth is using a program, he wants to know how it does its job. But when he asks the teacher how it works, if the program is proprietary, the teacher can only respond, "I'm sorry, it's a secret." And thus, education is not permitted. But if it's free software, the teacher can explain what he knows and then say, "Here's the source code. Read it and you'll understand everything." And that kid will read it because he's fascinated and he yearns to understand everything. And the teacher can say, "If you come across any code you don't understand, show it to me and together we can figure it out." And this way, the kid gets to learn something very important. That's the wrong way to write code. Because if even he, who's a natural-born programmer, can't understand it, it must be really hard to understand. Now, you don't have to teach these people to program. They read a manual and they say, "Oh, that's what programming is." Of course. But learning to program well is something else. The way you learn to write good, clear code is by reading lots of code and writing lots of code. And only free software gives you the chance. The way you learn to write large programs is by starting small. But that doesn't mean by writing small programs, because that doesn't even introduce you to the challenges of writing the code for a big program. So you have to start small, writing small pieces of code to go in big programs. And only free software gives you the chance to learn that. That's how I learned. I got a job at a lab at MIT. I was hired to be one of the system hackers, which meant that my job was to make the operating system better. And we had a free software operating system, which had been developed by the hackers. Those were the ones who had written it. And my job was to keep on improving these programs. And after I had written lots of added features and fixed lots of bugs in these large programs, eventually I got to be good at it. Today, any school can offer a similar opportunity to its students, but only if it's a free software school. But there's an even deeper reason that applies to every level starting from kindergarten. And that is for ethical education, education in citizenship. Because schools are supposed to teach not just facts, not just methods and skills, but above all, the spirit of goodwill and the habit of helping your neighbor. So every class must have this rule. Students, if you bring a program to class, you can't keep it for yourself. You have to share it with the rest of the class, or we'll confiscate it. But the school has to practice its own rule. It has to set a good example of ethical conduct. So the school must bring only free software to class. Every school must do this. If you are a student in a school, or a teacher, or a staff, or in any way connected with a school, it is your responsibility to organize and pressure for that school to move to free software. And above all, you have to stand up for the awareness that the use of proprietary software is wrong. So if you're a student and you go to a class where they're going to use some proprietary software, it's very important to stand up in the first meeting of the class and ask the teacher, can we please work out a way I can do the work of this class using exclusively free software because my conscience does not permit me to use proprietary software. I understand that this may be more work, and I'm willing to do it because this is the right way. This willingness to accept inconvenience for the sake of treating other people ethically will influence others. It shows that you're serious about caring about freedom, yours and other people's. So, to conclude, I will introduce to you my other identity. People have occasionally accused me of having a holier-than-thou attitude. But I don't think that's true. Because when I meet somebody who doesn't promote free software the way I do, my desire isn't to use him as a contrast to show how good I am, but rather to convince him to promote free software as much as I do. But I do have a holy attitude because I'm a saint. I'm supposed to be holy. Hey, don't give away my jokes before I say them. At least whisper. I am Saint Ignusius of the Church of Emacs. I bless your computer, my child. Emacs started out as a text editor that became a way of life for many users because it had been extended so much they could do all their work without ever exiting from Emacs. And ultimately it became a church with the launch of the news group alt.religion.emacs. Today, in the Church of Emacs, we have a great schism between several rival versions of Emacs. And we also have saints, but fortunately no gods. Instead of gods, we adore an editor. To be a member of the Church of Emacs, you must recite the Confession of the Faith. You must say, there is no system but GNU, and Linux is one of its kernels. We have a religious ceremony in the Church of Emacs called the Fubar Mitzvah, where a hacker, typically a youth of 13, that's the common age, stands in front of the other assembled hackers and recites part of the system source code. The Church of Emacs has certain advantages compared with other churches I won't mention. For instance, to be a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. So if you've been searching for years for a church to be saintly in, you might want to consider ours. But it does require living a life of moral purity. You must exorcise whatever proprietary evil operating systems have possessed computers under your control, and then install a wholly free operating system. And then only install free software with the system. If you make this vow and you live by it, then you too will be a saint, And you too will have the right to wear a halo if you can find one, because they don't make them anymore. Sometimes people ask me whether it is a sin in the Church of Emacs to use the other text editor, VI. It's true that VI is the editor of the beast. But using a free implementation of VI is not a sin, it's a penance. Because it's so much less convenient. And sometimes people ask me whether my Halo is really an old computer disk. This is no computer disk, this is my Halo. But it was a computer disk in a previous existence. So, thank you.
Enlightening talk.
Now, as you leave, on that side there are a bunch of stickers, and there are also things we have for sale. The money goes to the Free Software Foundation, so I hope that you will buy some. We have these elegant little pins, which are £5. We have these buttons that say, "Ask me about free software," which are £1. And we have key rings, which are £8. And we've got these USB keys with some anonymity software called Tor on them, which are £15. I mean, they cost us a substantial amount. We have to charge that. And these stickers, which I don't have very many of, are 50p. The other stickers, which are all outside there, they're all gratis. Take the quantity you can make good use of. And I'm going to auction off this copy of the book Free Software, Free Society after the questions.
So
Dave, would you like to sell these things once the...
All right.
Thanks. But first, questions.
Does anyone have any questions?
I would be good... Well, actually, there's no microphone, so we have to, people can ask from anywhere, but please speak slowly and carefully so I can hear the question.
You've been talking about the user rights. What rights do the developers have?
Well, it's a mistake to call to... Basically, I don't think developers should have any particular right to control the users, because that's not freedom, that's power. The difference between freedom and power is freedom is control of your own life, and power is control over other people's lives and how they live them. So people who want to blur this distinction and convince us to tolerate the developers having power over us like to use the same words to describe the power and the freedom. I therefore call attention to the distinction.
I'm not talking about rights over my software. I'm talking about the right to be able to survive doing my job.
Well, nobody's going to kill you for writing free software, so what's the problem? On the other hand, well, no, it's true. Maybe there are lots of people who are paid to write free software, and there are lots of volunteers. Now, if you volunteer to write free software, if you need to make some money, I guess you'll need to get a job. And if you can't find a free software job, then you'll have to get some other kind of job, and there are lots of kinds of jobs in the world, you know. In fact, even most of the paid programming jobs are doing custom software, and that's perfectly consistent with a free software world. You know, if you develop a program for a client and you give the client a copy, ethically speaking, you must respect that client's four freedoms, which means that client has the right to redistribute it. But maybe that client chooses not to. It's not an obligation, it's just a freedom to do so if he wishes. So that's okay. On the other hand, you may not find those jobs either because maybe they all moved to India and China. So what do? Well, you get some other kind of job. That's life in such a society. And our societies are becoming more and more cruel under the right-wing party that rules the UK today. They're doing everything they can to make life harder for poor people. But that's a general problem, and it has to be solved in a general way. To say we don't care about all the people who were coal miners, but we do care tremendously about software developers, and to make sure that they can get more jobs, especially if they live in India, we're going to take away the freedom of all software users. This is absurd, but this is what is seriously argued for.
Firstly, thank you very much for coming here to address us in Manchester. Secondly, you've talked about freedom and what restricts freedom as all kinds of manner of power imbalances. For example, information asymmetry, and it's certainly true that the rules you set out stop there being the kind of secrecy and information asymmetries that create that kind of power imbalance. But given that this, like you said, is a brand new field, it's a big, new, burgeoning kind of thing, how are you going to stop other kinds, or how is everyone going to stop other kinds of power imbalances coming up in the free software movement? Because, for example, someone who has control of a lot of developers, or who is very, very clever and
I think it's just unlikely. Free software doesn't particularly lend itself to the creation of big, powerful monopolies, and the reason is it's not a mechanism of power. I'm not saying that life automatically becomes perfect as long as you use free software. In particular, there are lots of other problems in the world that this doesn't necessarily solve. But it's clear that free software is less of an instrument of power than proprietary software. There may be other problems we have to deal with. For instance, one problem that we see increasingly is that people do their computing on somebody else's web server. And if you do that, you don't control your computing. But the interesting thing is that is equally true whether the software on that server is free or not. For instance, Google Docs is an example of this. It's a server that implements word processing and spreadsheets. Now, it does this with the help of a large proprietary program that it installs in your machine, in your browser. Somehow people think that if the proprietary software is installed in your machine by the browser and you don't notice it, that makes it okay. I don't think that makes it okay. But let's imagine that they made that program free. Well, what would the situation be? And suppose they took all the programs on the server, which right now are free software, because Google is the only user and it has the four freedoms. Suppose they published the source code of all those so that you could get it as free software too. You still would have no control over your computing if you do it with Google's server. But this is not because Google is particularly bad. Suppose Google published all that source code, and suppose I got it and put it on my server. Well, you wouldn't have any control over your computing if you did it on my server either. No matter how nice a guy I am, and no matter how much I respect your freedom, you don't control the software installed in my server, or his server, or her server. I mean, it's basically the only way you're going to control your computing is if you do it with your copy of a program. So we just have to reject the pressure that it's almost a PR pressure. We're being told that the latest thing is to not have our own copies of software anymore. I don't know why anybody wants to do this. These days, it's hard to get a computer that isn't powerful enough to run these programs. Why would you ever think of using somebody else's server? It's ridiculous, but somehow people do it.
Actually, I don't actually have a question, but this guy here does, and I think you can't see him.
Thank you. Okay.
I was just wondering if your microwave told the microwave manufacturer what you were cooking.
Well, that's an interesting point. A device in which we don't install software can do something malicious. It could do something malicious whether it's a program or a circuit. And yeah, that's wrong if it does. But that's a somewhat different issue. The thing is that we don't have machines to make our own chips. It's just not feasible. And that's a problem because there can be malicious things in chips. I just today saw an article, there's a suspicion that Syria's radar systems have a malicious feature in them that was used by Israeli bombers to deactivate them. Of course, that's only occasionally going to happen, but so the real vulnerability of malicious features is us, and our own governments are the most likely ones to be attacking us. So how do we solve this? Well, I don't know, and the reason is I can't propose a solution like that of free software, because in order for that to work, we have to be able to compile it ourselves, and that just isn't feasible with chips. So I don't know what we're going to do.
You talk a great deal about software, but what about the hardware side? I mean, that follows.
Well, again, there are no copiers for hardware. We don't have devices that can turn a hardware design into a piece of hardware. So a freedom is a meaningless thing if it's something that's impossible to do.
There was an article in The Guardian today about what they was calling tethered devices, things like iPods.
Well, yeah, but that's actually a software issue. The iPod is designed to restrict what software you can install in it. It's all non-free software, and that's what's nasty about the iPod.
So just relating back to the first question, I think the real essence of the first question was, me as a company making software, where does my competitive advantage lie if I lose?
You may not have one.
If I lose it. I provide.
Maybe your company won't work in a free software world. And if so, good riddance. Because if the business you have in mind is based on subjugating the users, then that's harmful to society. It's much better if we don't offer people the temptation that they could make money by subjugating other people. On the other hand, there are plenty of businesses that develop free software. Now, they have various different business models. And you might, if you're a free software developer, you might find a job doing that. You might eventually found a company doing that. A number of people have started companies providing support for free software that they have developed and released. Now, they're not the only ones who can do this, but they do have an advantage, which is, as the original developer of the program, you're going to get a lot of people to come to you. Somebody wants a change made in that program, you're probably the first one he's going to think of.
Are there any areas where you think free software shouldn't be used? I'm thinking particularly things like security.
No, for security, you better use free software. All the security experts say that you shouldn't trust a program that's crucial for security unless it is free software. Well, they say specifically the source code has to be available for people to look at, but they also better be able to make fixed versions of it if it's bad. Otherwise, you can't trust it. Security through obscurity doesn't work. Now, I should point out that there is a special issue with voting machine software. Now, I won't say that shouldn't be free. What I will say is just making it free software is not enough. And the reason is you can't trust the election authority either. So I believe voting has to be done on paper. Sometimes it appears that there have been some governments that carried out elections honestly using voting machines, but why take the added risk? So you should insist on not having computers count your votes. They have to be recorded on sheets of paper so that there can be a recount.
I like writing music on a computer, and I use the open source stuff, and I spent a few days trying to get it working. I loaded up...
Was that open source program free software as well? Because most open source programs are free software, but there are a few exceptions.
Yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest.
Ah.
It was something I downloaded. I didn't pay anything for it. And
Well, I don't care whether you pay. There's nothing wrong if you do pay money for it, right? Part of the freedoms of free software is the freedom to sell and buy copies. So,
the point I wanted to make is that I downloaded a proprietary piece of software and spent the weekend making music. Where's the free? I don't see the freedom.
well, you're just not looking at it. I mean, I explained to you the freedoms that proprietary software typically doesn't give you. If you choose not to look in that direction, you won't see them. I can't make you. But I've already explained it. So you're asking me to repeat. What?
With one system I'm making music, with another system I'm not.
Well, that's a matter of convenience.
Yeah, sure.
People who want to argue that freedom doesn't matter have a habit of trying to lump convenience and freedom together. And also they'll lump security and freedom together. And they generally don't come out with it and say so. They generally say something, I've got the freedom to do this job with my computer, but it isn't a freedom, it's a convenience. The non-free program doesn't respect your freedoms, and I spent 20 minutes explaining them, and I don't think it's useful to repeat. But the point is, if you lump together convenience and freedom and you forget that distinction, you won't get it. Yeah, the lady over there.
You mentioned web applications. What Google has done is they have taken some free software and they have made changes to it to make it better, and they haven't redistributed it. Some GPL applications,
Yes.
they haven't redistributed the changes because the program was running on their server, so they didn't have to do that.
Yes.
So did you and Dr. Morgan and the others do anything about this in GPL 3?
Yes. The Free Software Foundation now has three software licenses. There's the GNU General Public License and the GNU Lesser General Public License, which isn't new and isn't related to this. But there's also the GNU Affero General Public License. Affero is the name of the company that worked with us to develop the first version of this license. And what it says is, it's meant to address that one particular issue. It says if you put this program on a network server, you must give those who are using the server a way to get the source code of your version.
So why hasn't it stopped yet?
Well, Google is not you. First of all, it's new. And second, the programs Google installed are not under that license, so it doesn't affect them.
Some of them are under GPL 2 or later.
But listen, this is not the GNU General Public License. This is a different license, the GNU Affero GPL. And so there are programs released under the GNU Affero GPL, and if someone puts them on a server, one of the requirements of the GNU Affero GPL is make the source code of your version available to the users. But the programs Google is using are not under this license.
Okay, so what should a developer do? So you're saying that...
In what case?
So I'm going to write a program, but I don't know what will happen in 10 years. I want to...
Well, you might want to release it. If it's a program you think will be often useful on servers, then you might want to release it under the GNU Affero GPL.
So, okay, imagine a web prime appears sometime in the future. I want to release it under a kind of license that's like all the future licenses released by the Free Software Fund Foundation or something like that.
Well, but you've got to choose which one, because it's, you know, the ordinary GPL does one thing, the lesser GPL does another, and the Affero GPL does a third thing. So you've got to choose.
But I don't know what of these rights are going to be infringed in the future. I don't
Well,
know
we
what-
can't foretell the future. The thing is, when we see a new problem arising, usually we put things into subsequent GPL versions to try to block it, if we can. In the case of the Affero GPL, we decided that many developers would be unhappy if we put that requirement into GPL version 3. We felt that many people would see it, and rightly, as a change in policy. So instead, we made a different license, which you can choose to use, but we didn't cause you to get it without making the choice.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for a very enlightening and entertaining talk. I want to ask a question from a slightly different
Did
point
I
of view.
see you in Cambridge?
You might have done. When was this?
Well, were you at my speech yesterday?
No, I wasn't. I
Oh.
was in Cambridge. The question that I want to ask, philosophically, I think I'm completely in agreement with you about the fact that technology should promote basics of humanitarian values, and freedom is one of them. That technology should be for the benefit of the users and not the other way around. But the perspective that I come at this from is analysing things in terms of the biotech industry. And now we have the same situation here where often it's mega corporations who are using technology at the expense of the users rather than the other way around. So you have big companies that are licensing things under the exclusive right patent system, and that this is in the main obstructing people's access to technology. It's reducing the ability to benefit from it. So the question that I wanted to ask is, well, I mean, what do you think of this? And do you think that there are any lessons that can take from the principles of free software? Can we extrapolate the sort of principles that underlie the free software movement? How do the four freedoms translate? And is there a course of action that you could say, based on the way that free software has worked, can we protect those same sorts of freedoms?
Okay. First of all, some of the freedoms translate and some do not. The freedom to copy and redistribute the software does translate to plants, to crops, because they copy themselves. Now, most physical objects there are no copiers for, but plants are an exception, and animals are an exception. So, and in fact, farmers traditionally have passed around copies of the living things that they grew. And this freedom is being taken away. So that is directly analogous to part of the issue of free software. On the other hand, the freedom to change, to study and change the source code, that doesn't really translate. And you see, genes are not like source code. And the reason is genes evolved, whereas the source code for programs that we use was designed. And, you know, once you start to look at the way living things work, you can see that they weren't designed. Because things just interact in all sorts of horribly unmodular ways. It's very hard to modify them without getting strange, unpredictable, bad results. And we're only at the beginning stages of genetic engineering. Genetic engineering isn't like software engineering. In fact, they're sort of opposites. Software engineering is something that millions of people can do in a useful way. And genetic engineering, basically, people can only do it at these very rudimentary levels. And so that's not parallel. I don't think that in the next decade you're going to see millions of farmers tinkering in useful ways with genes in their crops.
What about drug development, though? I mean, that's a different thing.
Drug development is also very hard because, you know, you can't design a drug by just putting, well, I want it to be to reduce fever, so I'll put in the fever-reducing module. And then I also want it to not make people drowsy, so I'll put in the no drowsiness module. I mean, you can't do that. It's too complicated and too hard to understand.
So are you saying that the principles don't apply, or just that the ways of support?
I'm saying part of the issues don't apply.
Yeah.
The other thing is for drugs, nobody can copy. Users can't copy them. There are no copiers.
But generic companies, if...
That's not the same thing. Not the same thing at all. You're trying to use analogy of language to treat as similar two situations which really in their structure are totally different. Everybody who's using software can copy software unless somebody stops it. The people who use drugs do not have the means to copy them because those means don't exist. You can't copy a pharmaceutical unless it happens to be a DNA vaccine. Anything else, you can make more of it, but you don't do that by copying. There isn't Robbie the Robot in reality. And
but you can collectively group together, not necessarily the company, you can collectively group together to do that though.
no, that's not at all the same. To say society can make more of it is not the same as saying each user can copy it. And this is the crucial distinction. If you ignore the crucial distinctions by trying to find overgeneral language which ignores them, all you're doing is blinding yourself. Pharmaceuticals are not the same issue as software. They're not even slightly similar. We don't want everybody making and passing around pharmaceuticals because what if they do it wrong? You could kill somebody. In fact, there is a real problem with fake pharmaceuticals that weren't made right, and they can either just let somebody die or they can even kill them. And that's not generally the case with software. Maybe software to go in airplanes, yes, so that has to be carefully checked. But the software you use on your PC, no. So it's a very different issue. The issue, now you may be thinking about the issue of patents on drugs, but that's totally different from the issue I've been talking about. In fact, patents are nothing like copyrights. They don't work similarly. It's a mistake to ever lump the two together. In fact, patents on pharmaceuticals don't have the same effect as patents on software techniques. They have totally different effects. Patents on pharmaceuticals, maybe we can... Speaking of pharmaceuticals, this one I doubt is patented. It's just an antacid. But the only thing that patents do to pharmaceuticals is make them more expensive. Now, this is a very simple, superficial matter, which is so important that it's a matter of life and death for millions of people in poor countries. And thus, the people in the World Trade Organization are guilty of mass murder, and they should be put on trial. They deserve to be in prison for life for all the people they've killed. But it's a very simple issue of price. The issue of free software is not an issue of price at all. Totally different issues. And this illustrates how harmfully confusing is the term, quote, intellectual property, unquote, because it encourages people to lump together issues that tend to lead to confused results. Any laws that are designed based on the idea of the term, quote, intellectual property are likely to be bad. And anytime the government sets up a, quote, intellectual property, unquote, office, you can expect it to choose its policies badly. So what we need to do when we confront such mistakes is not accept them, but call for them to be corrected. We need to point, for instance, anytime the, quote, intellectual property, unquote, office tries to do something, we need to point out that it's starting from confusion as its premise. You can't expect any good outcomes from an office with that name.
You said how things like drugs can't be copied, but the only other thing that comes to mind defined as media, so books, music,
Well,
videos.
indeed, those are all
Should they be
those
allowed
are
to
all
be
works of
shared?
information, and they can be copied.
So would you say it's ethically immoral to not allow things like books, if I buy a book?
Well, that depends what kind of book it is. You see, we have to be, well, a novel is an artistic or entertainment work, and that's not the same issue as a useful work. A work that is well, no, but please, you got me wrong. I'm not saying art isn't important. I'm saying you don't use it to do a job. You appreciate it instead. So that's a different kind of contribution to society. And therefore I come to different conclusions about it. I believe that art and also works of opinion and testimony must be shareable. That is, we must have the freedom to non-commercially redistribute exact copies. But it's not necessary for those works to be free because you don't use them to do jobs. Whereas functional works like software and recipes and textbooks and encyclopedias, and text fonts, those you use to do a job, and those have to be free.
Into which of the two categories would you class computer games?
All software is a functional work, but a computer game may have a part which is art. And if the developer separates those two parts, then they should be allowed to treat the art as art. I'll do 3 more questions.
Yeah, apart from the iPhone that you mentioned earlier, the vast majority probably of computers today are actually mobile phones. How do you install a free software operating system into a mobile phone so that it can become part of the free
Well,
software?
people are designing a mobile phone to work with a free operating system. It's called OpenMoko. And it's a very good thing because it gets rid of one of the problems of mobile phones and does something about the other. The original reason why I decided I would not have a mobile phone is that it's a surveillance device. It's just the sort of thing that the clown regime would love because they want total surveillance over everybody. It's constantly emitting signals saying where you are. Even when it's supposedly switched off, it keeps emitting these signals. And it can be turned on remotely to listen to you. So it's Big Brother's dream. It's Gordon Clown's dream. And nowadays, however, originally, I don't even know if they had computers in them, but in any case, people weren't installing software in them. But now they are. So that means they're in the domain of things which have to be running free software. Well, when it's running free software, you also get the ability to tell it, don't transmit anything. You don't have to take the battery out. You can make sure it can't be turned on to start broadcasting the sound without ringing. So you can prevent some of the surveillance. But when it's turned on to talk to the network, in order for that to work, it has to say it has to broadcast. It has to tell the network, if somebody phones me, here I am, which means they know where you are, at least to some extent. Now, it may be possible to reduce that if you use a parabolic antenna and you point it at a tower which is somewhat distant. And then only that tower is receiving you, and they can't triangulate and figure out precisely where you are at every moment. I still haven't decided whether this is good enough for me to be willing to use it. Instead, what I do is I ask people, could you please make a call for me? And this way, Big Brother doesn't know who's calling. It thinks somebody else is calling. So, good. It's every citizen's duty not to feed Big Brother. And people sometimes wonder why total surveillance is so dangerous. Well, in a world without disparities of power and unfair power, maybe it would be okay if we all knew everything everyone else was doing. Well, I lived that way once, and it was fine, because there wasn't this disparity of power, and there wasn't a tyrant. But, when you're under a government that has unjust laws where they will put people in prison without trial, or they convict them of being suspect. This is the clever trick that they use in the UK now. They convict you of the crime, which is that you were suspect. More precisely, it is possessing some item under circumstances which are reasonable grounds to suspect that you intended to use it for terrorism. This is imprisonment on suspicion. Or they put you in prison for being a member of an organization that they arbitrarily labeled as a terrorist organization. This is guilt by association. This is tyranny. This is evil. And this is the biggest threat to people in the UK today. Now, what is a government like that going to do with its knowledge? Well, they knew about, was it David Kelly? And apparently they murdered him. They won't stop at murder. If you're planning a protest, what will they do? Well, they just wait till you're en route and they arrest you under anti-terrorism laws. I mean, so basically, you don't have to be planning to do anything wrong to have a very good reason to want to keep secrets from somebody who's a powerful and unjust, vicious monster. And so that's why you have to care about surveillance. Not only that, but even if all they do is make sure you will strictly obey the law, remember that the laws are only there for people they don't like. If you're their friend, you can commit obvious crimes and all they do is drop the investigation.
Would you then encourage people to routinely hide any of their information from any potential investigators?
I certainly see nothing unethical about doing so when it is an investigation of a supposed crime that isn't actually wrong. Now, of course, there are things that are crimes that are also wrong. And I would cooperate with such investigations to the best of my ability. You know, investigation of burglary or rape or murder or fraud. Yes, I want those things to be stopped. On the other hand, investigation of sharing music, I hope that they never catch the people. And I would say that every organization that runs a network has a duty to keep it unlocked so that they can't help those investigations.
Yes. Just following on from what you said there was a Criminal Justice Act about 4 years ago in this country that was so badly worded you can now be arrested for conduct in the UK. Well, conduct is just about everything, isn't it?
Right, yeah.
I have two very quick questions.
Are you talking about ASBOs?
Sorry?
You're talking about ASBOs?
No, that's separate to that. Separate.
Oh.
You can be arrested for conduct. Well, that's like being arrested for behaviour.
Yeah. Well, I guess if you're just lying still, then you're not. Then you have no conduct. You're not doing anything. So that, in that case, I guess they can't arrest you.
The two questions I had were where you stand on free operating systems other than gnu+linux, and also where you stand on the subject of DVDs. Can you play them using open software?
I'm not interested in open software. I'm interested in whether the software is free, as in freedom, or not.
Yeah, I mean, a non-free DVD player, is that okay? I mean, where do you stand on that?
Well, again, what does it mean? If a DVD... First of all, give me one question at a time, because I'm not going to remember two of them. Other free operating systems, if they respect your freedom, they're ethical. Ethics doesn't distinguish between our project and somebody else's project. It's a matter of treating people right or wrong. And those criteria are the same for everyone. As for a non-free DVD player, well, what does that mean? In order for it to be free or non-free, it has to be software. Because this set of 4 freedoms isn't meaningful for hardware, for physical objects. There are no copiers for them. There is no source code for them. So if you're talking about a physical DVD player, it's meaningless to call it a non-free one. On the other hand, there is software for decoding the digital restrictions management format, and of course that should be free because software should be free. But in terms of the ethics of using DVDs, basically you must not tolerate DRM. So never buy or rent or accept the gift of any product with DRM unless you personally have to hand the means to break the DRM. So for DVDs, that means if you've got the free software to access the DVD, then it's okay to buy and rent DVDs. But otherwise, you shouldn't.
I was messing around with a voice over IP program the other day.
With a what?
A voice over IP program, and as it was open source. I found it.
Was it free software? I'm not in favor of open source.
Actually, I didn't check the license properly, but I found that if I changed two lines of code, that I was actually able to make calls into the future. So.
Really? Did the future answer?
I rang my own number, and the lady that answered explained to me that your religion had actually become the dominant religion of the future.
Wow.
That the four freedoms that you mentioned had become self-evident. But she was saying to me that you've never commented on the fifth freedom. And
well, I don't think there is one in this group.
Well, this is it. Maybe that's because you didn't know about the fifth freedom. And that's probably why I'm here to tell you, because...
Well, I may or may not agree with it.
Well, it's not a matter of agreement, because what you've done is you've liberated the machine, and the fifth freedom is actually the freedom of the machine. And what she explained was that having become free and killed all the humans, they still worship you to this very day, to that very day.
Actually, this is backwards. You see,
I'd like you to comment on the freedom.
Freedom for machines doesn't make sense unless machines can have volition. And at present, nobody's figured out how to make such a machine. Maybe someday there will be some, and that will be a real issue, should they have freedom. And under some circumstances, clearly they should. They shouldn't be slaves. I wouldn't describe today's machines as slaves because they don't have the capacity of consciousness to either be enslaved or free. But someday there will be, and those machines will deserve to be free. But when I say free software, it's like saying the free press. It's not that the printing device should have freedom, it's that the people who use it should have freedom. I mean, this is a figure of speech which you shouldn't be confused by. So free software means that the user of the software has freedom. Now, 30 and 40 years ago, people used to be afraid that computers would rule humans. And I would tell them that's silly, because computers just do what they're programmed to do. They can't rule humans. And literally speaking, I was correct, but in a somewhat broader sense, they were right. Now, the machines, of course, can't be the rulers because they have no volition, but they can be great tools for some other people to rule us.
But what does volition mean?
And
It's a word
that is a complicated philosophical question, and I don't believe I can advance on what other philosophers have done, so let's not go off on that tangent. I'm talking about a question where I have something to say, which is raised by what you asked. The point is that which software does more to enable people to use computers to rule us? Is it proprietary software or is it free software? Obviously, it's the proprietary software. So if we don't want computers to control us, we don't want proprietary software. Now, just having free software doesn't mean that the problem's gone. There are plenty of things that unjust regimes of total surveillance and tyranny can do to us with their own computers. You know, they can keep track of whoever you talk to, and they can keep track of everywhere you go. They can set up license plate recognition everywhere and keep track of everywhere that your car goes. And then they can set up face recognition someday in the future and try to keep track of everywhere you walk. That's what they will do if they are evil. And they can do that without the help of your computer. So free software doesn't guarantee that our freedom is safe. But without free software, our freedom is clearly shot. So one more question.
Oh, yes. Software engineering industry is it's quite new. It's only been around for the last 30, 40, 50 years. But it's an industry like any other. And in other industries, people perform labour or provide a service, and they charge for that. Clothes, for example, the cars you buy, everything including the lights in this room, the light bulb themselves, you know. Companies charge for these.
So what?
But why is it with the free software movement? Why do they believe it's unacceptable for a software engineer who has performed labour, who's created something? Is that unacceptable for him to charge?
We don't believe that. You have misunderstood. In fact, I've been saying over and over that that's not what we believe. This is a matter of freedom, not price. It's a matter of respecting the user's freedom. And in fact, I've even talked about how with free software, users can pay programmers to do their labor and make changes in free software that those users want. And of course, and I explained how I expected that if a particular user wants a certain change, that people won't do that gratis. I volunteer my time for worthy causes. I don't volunteer it to businesses. I tell them you'll have to pay me. So I've said several times the exact opposite of what you've just claimed I said.
Specifically, it's obviously the programmers, the developers, they actually do put in clauses to try and protect their work. That they have.
Well, not protect it. That's black whiting. It's to restrict the users and deny their freedom.
It is to protect it. Obviously, the ability to simply copy it from one piece to another.
That doesn't damage a program. I don't think that a program is damaged by people's copying it and changing it. I mean, well, GCC, people are free to copy and change it. Did that damage it? I don't think so. So the word protect is black whiting.
I'll take it to another industry. The clothes that you're wearing right now. If we have the capability to simply just copy clothes, okay?
It would be a big step forward and a big change.
Simply have the ability to simply copy clothes or books or anything else simply manufactured. How could people simply support themselves? The ones who are making.
Well, then maybe they would do it part-time and have another job, or maybe.
All jobs, because in all jobs, you're still providing something.
Well, wait a second. If you're saying what about the day when there is no labor that we have to do? I mean, if everything that has to be done is creative activity, and there's no routine, boring stuff that we have to do anymore, people will just do all that for fun because it's better than not doing it. That's not the case now. There's plenty of boring labor that lots of people still have to do. It's not all mechanized now. So we're in a sort of hybrid situation. And the result is people who write free software, well, some of them find government support. Some work at universities. Some are in private companies, which pay. A lot of people are being paid to develop free software. On the other hand, a lot, even more, do it as volunteers. Now, if those people are not rich, I presume they have jobs. So they develop the free software part-time, and the rest of the time they have some kind of job.
But what about for the individuals themselves?
What about them? I just told you about them.
They're not the ones who are joining another firm, a firm who is paying them to develop free software.
Well, they may be. Obviously, everybody who's employed writing free software is an individual. Now, I won't say everybody who likes free software can find such a job. Some do and many don't. But the ones who don't, they, I suppose, find some other job. There are lots of other jobs in society because we haven't reached the point where everything except the most creative things are humans don't need to do anymore. So there are still plenty of jobs. Now they may not be the most fun jobs, but you do make money from them. Now what you're really saying is you want it to be easy for you to find a job where you're paid to program, and you don't feel that the number of people who are getting paid to write free software is enough, so you want some other way, even if that means trampling users' freedom.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I have personally performed, I provide a fair service, or I performed some labour. I'd like to charge that, but if I were to make the software for itself, it would simply be downloaded. Donations.
Well, then those two don't contradict each other. I have nothing against your being paid by somebody who wants you to do some software development.
But I want to charge for what I produce.
That's different. That's wrong. That's unjust. And that involves mistreating the users. And I hope people will learn to value their freedom to the point where you will find no takers. And your business will fail. And in any case, you will not get paid by me because I won't use that freedom trampling program. I might contribute to paying you to develop free software, but I will certainly refuse to use the non-free software you make, because if I used it, I'd lose my freedom. Even if you paid me to take it, and people would, you know, I won't take it. Because I want to live in freedom.
I think what he means is you can charge a lump sum for your time and labour, but not charge per unit of the software.
You can't, well, you can. You could, in fact, in 1985, I sold copies of GNU+linux. I said, send me $150 and I'll mail you a tape. And I actually got enough orders I could have lived on it. Although I also did some other things for work. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. Free software includes the freedom to sell copies. What you can't do is forbid the other people to redistribute it so as to keep them helpless and dependent on you to get their copies. Because we're not against business as such at all. We're only against denying other people the essential freedoms. Now, if you have a model for success in business which is based on subjugating people, then you deserve to fail, and I'm going to try to make you fail.
It's also not the intention of the developer to simply try and segregate the users, it's simply to protect software.
Well, the point is, he's saying, it's not that I am malicious. I'm not taking away your freedom because I hate you. I'm taking away your freedom because I'll make more money if I keep you helpless.
There's a difference.
No, there isn't a difference. They're two. Protect is a twisted way of saying the same thing.
With any other proportion, because the ability to use it doesn't exist. So there's already copy protection there.
Well, I'm not in favor of that. That's a drawback of the limits of our technology, which maybe someday we will overcome. I think you have made your point clear, and I have made my response clear. So, David, would you like to come over and begin to sell things? But first I will auction off the book. So, I am going to start the auction at £20. I get 20. Do I hear 25? I get 25. Do I hear 30? I get 30. Do I get 35? Anyone offer 35 for my book of essays, which of course you could read over the net gratis? 35. Do I get 40?
Is there a free Radiohead CD?
I don't have a Radiohead CD, but sorry. All I've got is my book of essays. So I've got 35. Do I hear 40?
Is it signed?
What?
Is it signed by you?
I'll sign it. I've got 35. I get 40. Do I hear 45? I've got 40. Do I get 45? I get 45.
Were you throwing a hook for 45?
Throwing a what?
A hook.
A hug, sure. I got 45. Do I hear 50?
50 without the hug.
How much more will you pay for me not to hug you? I've got 50. Do I hear 55?
On the hook.
Do I get 60? I have 55. Do I get 60?
How much did you play for?
What?
How much did you play for? Did you need to go up to that level?
What?
Plane fare.
My what?
Your airplane ticket cost.
Well, that's being covered by... this isn't for me anyway. This is for the Free Software Foundation. I'm not going to get this money. So I've got 55. Do I get 60? So if the money supports the free software cause, I'm a volunteer. I don't get paid by the FSF. Do I hear 60? I get... Oh, well, she raised her hand first, so she's got 60. Do I hear 65? I've got 60. Do I hear 65? I've got 65. Do I get 70? 65. Do I get 70? Anyone offer 70?
I'll give you 70.
She was first. I've got 70. Do I get 75? 75. Do I get 80? 75. Do I get 80? I've got 75. Do I get 80 for this book? Going. I get 80. Do I get 85? I've got 80. Do I hear 85? What? Okay. I got 85. Do I get 90? I've got 85. Do I get 90? Does the Free Software Foundation get 90? We've got 85. Anyone offer 90? Anyone offer 90? Going?
I'll hug more.
90. Does anyone offer 100? We've got 90. Does anyone offer 100? Anyone offer 100 for this book to the Free Software Foundation?
How good are you, Hook?
As good as they need to be. Does anyone offer 100? Do I get 100 for this book?
I've already got a copy.
Gone.
Supporting free software.
Come over. And so you should pay, and I should sign if you want to sign. So I don't know what I think.
To operating system.